Well, here we are again, and in this lecture we're going to be looking at the style of Romanticism. Now, it might seem like to you, as we're moving through these lectures, that there's a sort of linear progression, that we kind of move from one style to the next, and it's like one style existing after the other. And in some cases, that is what's going on. But in other cases, like what we're actually seeing in this lecture, is we're actually looking at styles that are coexisting. And one style that we are seeing Romanticism coexist with is the style of Neoclassicism, which we just recently learned about. Now, even though these styles are existing at the same time, right, we're looking at the early 1800s and in the same place in France, these are very, very different styles. And we're definitely going to come to see that as we look at some art. Now, one of the things that's very different about Romanticism and Neoclassicism has to do with context. Now, Romanticism, this is actually a literary genre. This is the origins of Romanticism, a literary genre, not necessarily art. What happens is we have the literary genre, and that inspires visual art that correlates thematically. Now, I want to point this out because this is really important, actually, this relationship between art and these literary genre. We're going to start to see more and more and more in this class a sort of closer relationship between text and the visual arts, either in terms of visual arts growing out of these different literary or poetic genres, or text having a very important role in explicating art, explaining art. And we're going to see that with the manifesto. Don't worry about what manifesto means just yet. We'll talk about that more once we get into art that was produced after the First World War. So Romanticism is this literary genre, and it's very much about fantasy. It's about the imagination. And these are what these stories incite through their fantasy is one's imagination. It gets one's emotions going. And you have all of these really great fanciful tales that appeal to, as I said, fantasy, but even adventure. Like we're seeing this amazing Delacroix painting of a tiger hunt, right? This like tiger coming up and gnawing on this horse's leg. So epic. This is the kind of stuff that Romanticism is talking about. And it really appeals to subjective experience because, emotion, fantasy, these mean different things to different people, and we react to them in very personal ways, which is why we are attracted to this sort of literary genre. Now, of course, when you have something that really promotes individuality and something that really impacts people on an emotional level, that can make rulers who are trying to control people uncomfortable. And don't forget, there was this guy, you may have heard of him. His name is Napoleon, right? And he's the one that's overseeing France at this time. And he's not that into Romanticism because of that. He wants to kind of keep control over people getting all excited about cool stuff like tigers attacking horses. That's making him nervous. And so what he does is he bans the literary genre of Romanticism. And you know what happens when you ban something? People want to read it even more. And so that little attempt actually attributes to the increasing popularity of this genre. And then, of course, it spreads, and we see it in painting, and we see it in sculpture. We even see an architectural movement that is related to Romanticism as well. Now, as you see at the bottom of the screen, I'm kind of setting this against the Enlightenment, right? This is very different than the Enlightenment, because if you recall back to our neoclassical lecture, and indeed the style of neoclassicism, it's this idea of, thinking critically about the world around you and being, a good citizen and being someone who is studying and examining and really just, again, kind of thinking critically about all things political, economic, social, cultural, etc. not fantasy, not imagination, not tigers gnawing on horses' legs, right? So very, very different context that clearly is going to affect the type of themes that these two styles are addressing. You know the type of themes that we see in Neoclassicism. We're seeing things like classical history, classical literature, imperial themes, political themes. In America, we don't address this in the lecture, but you read about it in your book. You've got democratic themes, which certainly do relate back to the classical period. Now, we'll talk about the common themes in Romanticism in just a minute. I want to point out one more really important point of context. Now, I'm not going to go super in depth into industrialization at this moment. I want to save that for you, keep you on the edge of your seats until we get to realism, which is our next style. And that's, I think, with realism where we really start to see the effects of industrialization being truly and meaningfully addressed by artists. Now, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, this is not a new thing that people are first ever experiencing in the early 1800s. We actually see industrialization in the modern sense as early as the 1680s, but we don't see it as a movement being fully realized, having its impact on humanity until around the early 1800s. Maybe we could even go as early as like the late 1700s. Now, with industrialization, it introduces all sorts of sweeping changes. And again, I'm going to go over this more the next lecture, so I'm not going to, repeat myself. But we will see that Romantic artists are going to address some of these industrial themes. I'll just say that, and then I'll show you some specific examples when we're actually looking at artwork. So I know you're wondering, like, well, what are the common themes? What's Romanticism all about besides clearly being the most epic style of all time? A few things. So first of all, a common theme with Romanticism is we have this idea of telling historical events in really dramatic ways, right? Telling historical events in really dramatic ways. Now, that's where the imagination part is coming in. The history part's certainly real, but imagining it happening in this very epic way, that's, I think, where some fantasy is starting to come into play. And again, you're going to see what I mean. So the retelling of historical events in really dramatic ways, that's one thing. Another thing that we're going to see is we're going to see man versus nature. Man versus nature. And it's my thought that this focus on man versus nature really is a reflection of some of the anxieties that are being introduced by industrialization. We'll talk more about those anxieties in a minute. But I will just say this one thing quickly. This idea of, for example, cities that are growing populations, growing buildings, and so nature is being immediately evident around you, not something you're going to readily see. Demographic shifts where people are moving from the countryside into the city, so they're not living in these natural environments. Beautiful, unspoilt natural environments that are now having factories built on them. We have also, going out and the extraction of natural resources to produce, to process in these factories. Also something that's impacting the natural environment. Those kind of things are making people think about, well, what is our relationship with nature, our traditional relationship and the current relationship that we have. So that's why man versus nature is coming into play. Another thing that's happening is this. When Napoleon is ruling over France, one of the things we know about Napoleon is he really likes to go out and try to take over other places. So what happens is he goes out and he's exploring and he's, doing his imperialist agenda. He's going to places that people hadn't heard of before or were really familiar, and they seemed very exotic and very strange. And again, that dovetails quite neatly with this notion of fantasy and imagination. So we see a lot of exotic subjects. Exotic in terms of the way that France is imagining them. Not necessarily the way they actually are, because again, it's fantasy, not reality, but these sort of fantastical imaginations of what it's like to be in, like, for example, Algiers, right, in Africa, something like that, or the Middle East, the exotic. And then also, if we're thinking about fantasy, what's another thing that we think about? Sexy time, right? Now, we're not seeing like sexy time per se being depicted in romantic art, but we are going to see that there are aspects of eroticism, and not all romantic images, but certainly in some. Now, I know this is pretty exciting stuff. Let's see what Romanticism is all about. Now, before we get into full-on Romanticism, I want to look at a couple of transitional images. And we've seen transitional images before. This idea that not one day every single artist is working in Neoclassicism, the next day nobody is, and everyone's a romantic, right? That we do see an overlap. We have examples of artwork where it's incorporating the waning features of this older style in alongside these features of an ascending, newly growing style. So this is a incredible painting by the artist Ingres. It looks like it's Ingres, but you pronounce it French-like. It's Ingres. And this is one of these transitional images. Okay, there's things that are neoclassical, there's things that are romantic. This is a great opportunity for some review, for you to test yourself on how well you know neoclassicism. What I suggest is you pause the video and look at this painting and see if you can determine what is neoclassical. So try that out. So hopefully you did that. Hopefully you paused the video. Hopefully you tried it out. Hopefully you reviewed. So what's neoclassical about this? A few things, actually. So one thing we have is we have the shallow stage-like space. We have this figure, she is up to the front of the foreground, right? Without very much deep space behind her. And what's obscuring this sense of space is our kind of Caravaggio-esque tenebralism situation. And we saw some of that with, like, for example, David's Oath of the Horatii, right? So we have some of that dark background. Now, I kind of like it better thinking of the dark background as this way to facilitate a sort of spotlight. With Caravaggio, his figures sort of emerge out dramatically from the background. No one's emerging out here. It's a black background because there's like this like stage light, spotlight shining down on this figure. This notion of the stage in terms of space, in terms of lighting. It's very dramatic, and that is maybe a little bit of an opportunity for some overlap between neoclassicism and romanticism. Drama. But you want to know what? Romanticism takes it one step farther than what we're seeing with neoclassicism. Now, another thing that feels very neoclassical to me, and you will not know this yet, so I'm going to point it out for you, is the brushwork. The brushwork is very tight, it's very crisp. Now, you do know that, but what you don't know is that's not something that we will see in romanticism. Well, you will know that in a few minutes. So very tight, very crisp brushwork. That's neoclassical as well. Even maybe perhaps the treatment of this form is somewhat classicizing. I'm saying somewhat because have you noticed how weird it is? It's a sort of uncanny valley, as they say. Have you looked at how like weird this butt situation is? Or, for example, this leg? This leg is impossible. It makes me almost wonder if it's someone else's leg. This may be someone in the dark who's just kind of like laying their leg over, but I don't think so. I think it's hers. It's weird, right? Weird body. That is definitely not something that would come out of classicism, because we know that classicism is really looking at idealism. And this is very strange, not ideal. You know what this reminds me of? Mannerism. Reminds me of a mannerist treatment of form, and Ong is into that. He does some other ones, other paintings where you see weird proportions like that. So somewhat of a classicizing nature, in that we've got kind of some fleshiness and a sturdiness to the form, but I would think that the proportions deviate a bit. Let me see, do I see anything else that seems neoclassicism? I think for me, that about does it. So what's romantic then about this? This is where I can introduce some new features to this that you might not be as familiar with. So first of all, let's talk about the subject matter. That's really the big one here. Remember what types of subjects are typical with Neoclassicism. You know this from the notes. What we're looking at here is we're looking at an Odalisque. An Odalisque is a member of a Turkish harem. So Turkish harem, the harem is this group of women just kind of hang out, lazing about, and just waiting for the Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, as it were, to come in and, have some sexy time. So here's this lady, she's naked, she's laying there, she's waiting for the Sultan to come to choose her for a little bit of sexy time. So we have the exotic, because this is Turkey, and Turkey is very exotic. This is the doorstep to the Middle East. So to the French, this was very unfamiliar. And this exoticism is referred to with this amazing tapestry, this peacock feathered fan. She's wearing a turban, right? That's not French headdress. This is definitely something that's Middle Eastern. All this sumptuous fabric. And a hookah pipe, right? Which, by the way, the hookah pipe is not only functioning to show this exotic aspect, but phallic symbol as well, right? Phallic symbol also. So these are the exotic aspects, and the fact that she's, an Odalisque. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here. And this is, again, where this idea of fantasy is coming in, because this is as the French understand these women to be. They're imagining that at a harem, these women just lay around naked smoking a hookah all the time. And look at her. Does she look Middle Eastern to you? I don't know. She looks kind of Western European in my mind. So they're really taking this idea of the Turkish culture and they're fantasizing, turning it into these points of fantasy, these beautiful sexually available women, but using a cultural language that the French understand. Now, this might seem innocent enough, but it's a problem because, first of all, it's cultural appropriation, but second of all, by taking away this culture and presenting it notions of fantasy that are inaccurate, it delegitimizes that Turkish culture. So that's just something to keep in mind. Let's look at another example. This is another transitional image. This is one that was commissioned by Napoleon. Now, Napoleon, he didn't like Romanticism, and we know why. But just because he didn't like it didn't mean that he didn't see the value in Romanticism. And let's take a little trip down memory lane to the Italian Baroque style and how the style and these works of art commissioned by the church, they saw the propagandistic power that appealing to the emotions could have. Napoleon is no dummy. He also is seeing how this can work in his advantage. So even though he's not liking it, doesn't mean he's not going to exploit it. So let's talk about then what is Romanticism, what's Neoclassicism. Let's start again with Neoclassicism. So one thing that's Neoclassicism is Napoleon himself, right? This idea of looking at imperial themes. That's a neoclassical theme. Another thing that is neoclassical is polarities, that coexistence of opposites. So if we draw our dividing line down the middle, we have the French here, and then we have the opposite of that, which are the Muslim doctors who are caring for the sick. So the French and the other. Those are the two. We can also note the shallow stage-like space. Now this is a little bit more. This is now some Romanticism coming into play. This goes a little bit back into the background, more so than what we were seeing with Death of Marat or the Oath of Horatii. But the action is in the foreground, and we've got our dramatic spotlight light. I would venture to argue, and you can disagree with me if you want, that there's kind of both brushwork here. We do have the tighter, crisper brushwork that's typical of neoclassicism, but in the back, we have the loose, hazy brushwork that you're going to come to see is more typical of the Romantic approach. The other thing that's romantic about this work is that exotic element. So Jaffa is located in Syria, which is in the Middle East. And so you have these Middle Eastern elements, not only culturally through these people and their ethnicity and their clothing, but architecturally with these arches, with this back in here. Here's a minaret. They're in a mosque, right? So we've got some exotic features also. Now what's happening here is a little bit of PR, a little bit of propaganda. So what happened was the French troops were off fighting in Syria, and there was an outbreak of the plague. And the story is that Napoleon said, okay, keep it hush-hush, but we're just going to go ahead and kind of like exterminate these soldiers, or just kind of leave them behind. It's unclear if it was just to leave them behind or actually kill them. So this got out, and the French public wasn't exactly thrilled with this idea that these people are giving their lives for Napoleon's imperialistic agenda, and he's just like setting them aside just because they're sick. So he wants to sort of fix this and say, not only do I totally care about my troops, but I actually went there personally, right? And here he is, personally caring for the plague-stricken. It's so beautiful. These people are like covering their mouths. He's touching an open sore. That's how brave Napoleon is. That's how much he cares. Very much evocative of imagery of Jesus healing lepers, which that is bold. But Napoleon's going there, and we're not surprised. And it's emotional. It's emotional, and that's the idea. So people see this, they see the personal care of Napoleon, all in his uniform, all authoritative and powerful. This guy's like looking up in awe. This light's like pretty much the light of God shining down. I imagine that like music in the background. Very epic, and that's the point. Let's move on and let's look at a full-on true romantic image, no neoclassicism. This is a pretty significant image. And the reason why is this. What we're looking at is a painting called The Nightmare. And this painting is significant because this is, as far as we know, one of the earliest works of art in all of art history to address this notion of the subconscious. And this is huge because this opens up this entire avenue now for artists to investigate in terms of capturing the human experience and an image. And as we move on, we're going to get to styles like surrealism. And we can tip our hat to Fusell for introducing this to us, this notion of the subconscious. You have this woman who is dreaming, but she's actually having a nightmare. And you can see her like levitating off the bed, which is great because that allows her to have this very dramatic, very epic positioning where she's, head's thrown back. Her mouth is partly open. Her arm extends down. That drama, that emotionalism that's so typical of the Romantic style. On top of her sits an incubus, which is a creepy demon that in the medieval period was believed to come and prey sexually on women. And you have her head thrown back with the exposed neck. And this very typically represents vulnerability. So she's vulnerable to this creepy demon who sits on top of her. And then creepy horse coming out of the background. Maybe we do see a little bit of our Baroque and a little bit of our Neoclassicism here with that tenebranistic treatment of light here and putting everything in the foreground. You have a looser approach of the brushwork, and then look at the theme. This is fantasy, this is imagination, this is something new, this is subconscious. This would never appear in something like Neoclassicism. So good. And here's another one. So good. If someone told me you have to teach the style of Romanticism and you can only use one image, I would choose this one. Because I feel like this image has all the features of Romanticism. Everything. That's why it's so amazing. Raft of the Medusa by Gericault. So first of all, this is an example of a work of art that is treating a historical subject dramatically. So what happened was there was a slave ship. It was called the Medusa. Now, one of the issues that was happening in France during this time was there was a lot of cronyism going on, a lot of nepotism. And so what happened was there was this like high-ranking Navy guy who like knew somebody, good friend, brother, whatever. And it's like, oh, hey, good friend, you don't know how to drive a boat, but because we're friends, I want to hook you up. You're going to become the captain of the Medusa. So here's a guy, doesn't know how to drive a boat, and here's a surprise ending. The boat sinks. So what happens is the boat sinks, and just like a Titanic situation, there's not enough rafts. So pretty much everyone dies. And so we've got this raft here, which has the few survivors from the Medusa. Now, this is like a 2-in-1 because it's not just a dramatic recounting of a historical event. This is also man versus nature. This raft is on the choppy seas. There's waves, there's wind, there's clouds, there's a storm coming. So these people are struggling against the elements as they fight to be saved. You have this really nice pyramid composition where you have this sort of intensification of movement that culminates here at the very top, where you've got a person waving down, hoping to flag a passerby. Now, this itself is a statement, and this is itself a reflection of the impact that industrialization had on Romantic artists. It's a comment on slavery. Slavery and industrialization, these are not mutually exclusive. There's a relationship here because what was happening is France, England, even America going out and colonizing these certain areas of the world. And what they would do is they would take the natural resources to, as I said, process in the factory. They also, though, would take the people. They would take the labor to either work in these countries or to extract the natural materials. Either way, they're taking slaves. So what's happening here is this person up here is an African, and one of the few Africans to actually survive the shipwreck. And he's the one at the top of the pyramid. He's the one that's going to wave down the passerby ship. They do get saved. See this little dot right here? That's the passing ship. And who saves all these people? The African. So it's a way to heroize this individual, a way to humanize him and to present him in a positive light, to argue that slavery was wrong. Now, let's talk about what's romantic. We've talked about the themes, right? A few themes: man versus nature, dramatic retelling of history. The drama itself is romantic, again in this pyramid of writhing bodies. So dramatic, it's so emotional. These people that are facing impending death in a multitude of ways. Some people are like desperate to live. This guy, he gave up. It's over. So a wide range of emotional responses to an intense situation. You've got a hazy brushwork, and this is to give you a sense of atmosphere. It contributes to the sense of drama. It gives you this idea of a setting sun, of a fiery sky, of the atmosphere of a storm coming. Think of like a monsoon. Before the monsoon comes, you feel it. You can feel like the electricity in the air. You feel the clouds building. You feel the rain coming. That's what that loose brushwork is meant to evoke. Dramatic gestures. and a much more complex composition than what we would see with Neoclassicism. We are definitely seeing the action in the foreground, but this is a much more complex interaction in terms of form and a much more deeper recession into space than the shallow stage-like spaces we typically see with Neoclassicism. Again, that little dot, right? That's way back in the back. A recession of space much more deeper than Neoclassicism. And then finally, this is kind of a joke, but kind of not. There always seems to be a random guy with no pants. Right here. Don't believe me? Let's go back. Oh, hey, random guy with no pants. Let's look at another example. Another amazing, another dramatic painting, this by the artist Eugene Delacroix. Liberty leading the people. Another dramatic retelling of a historical event. This event was the French Revolution of the 1830s. Now, I am not talking about the French Revolution that we talked about in the context of Neoclassicism. That was the French Revolution of 1789. In the French Revolution of 1789, the French are protesting the Enlightenment. Or not protesting the Enlightenment, they're protesting things that the Enlightenment is critiquing. Things like unequal distribution of wealth, the divine right to rule. They want a democracy rather than a monarchy. They see the revolution through and somehow end up with Napoleon. Now, they eventually get rid of Napoleon. They exile him, or he exiles himself. Either way, he's got to leave. Now, what do you think the French do? Do you think the French pay attention to history and learn from their mistakes? No. What they do is we have Charles X coming into power, another king. Not only is he another king, he's from the Bourbon family. Want to know who else is from the Bourbon family? All the Louis. Like Louis XVI, who was killed at the guillotine in the French Revolution of 1789. They're right back where they started. You want to know the surprise ending? It doesn't work out, and there's another revolution. Revolution of 1830. So in this revolution, Charles X, they're getting him out. Now we're seeing it here. Now what we're seeing this idea of liberty as an allegory. An allegory is kind of like a metaphor. It's an idea where this lady, they didn't really have some lady with no shoes on and her dress falling down driving the people forward. This woman is a metaphor for liberty. Just like our Statue of Liberty, that's also an example of an allegorical figure. So this allegory, this symbol of liberty, leading the troops ahead. Very dramatic, right? Pushing forward, arm up, with the flag raised up. Now the flag is significant. This is not the flag of France at the time. So at the time, the flag of France is a red and white flag with the crest of the Bourbon family. This is the tricolor. This is the flag of the Revolution. You want to know who designed this flag? Jacques-Louis David. What a boss, right? Amazing painter, and then designs the French flag on the side. Now, Napoleon, as we know, is no dummy. He kept this flag when he ruled over France. Charles X, not so smart. Takes his flag, brings it back. So then the flag comes back once again, the tricolor, which is the flag still of France today, a symbol of France, a symbol of revolution, a symbol of French democracy. So she has this symbol in her hand, leading them forward. The people are following her, the symbol of liberty, and by extension, the flag, which also symbolizes liberty. And then in her other hand, she's got this giant gun that's like as tall as she is. She leads forward a cross-section of the French public. You've got this little boy who's like a street urchin, pistol in each hand, leading forward fallen soldiers. A upper-class-man, an intellectual dandy with what looks like a sawed-off shotgun, and a factory worker here. And then is it me or does this guy look like Elijah Wood? I just am pointing that out. So she leads forward Elijah Wood in the cross-section of the French public. They move forward despite the obstacles, despite the sacrifice being represented with our fallen soldiers. And oh, hey, look, a random guy with no pants. This person sort of looking up in awe, this light shining down as if it's God himself, taking time out of his busy God schedule to personally oversee and support these people that are advocating for revolution. You've got the hazy brushwork in the background to give you a sense of atmosphere, in this case, light that's being sort of diffused by the smoke. And then back in here, we've got the westwork of the Notre Dame to show that this is a historical event, even though it's so dramatic and epic, this actually occurred in the streets of Paris. So good. Now, there is a romantic vein of painting in America. And where we are seeing this particularly is in the treatment of landscape paintings. I have a couple of really great landscape paintings to show you to finish off our lecture on Romanticism. One approach to romantic landscape painting came from the Hudson River School, named for this area, Hudson River, that the painters painted in. Now, school refers to like a group of artists, not necessarily a school where the artists are being trained. Probably one of the best known members of the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole. Now, you can see why this would be romantic. You've got landscape, but it's so dramatic, so epic. A low horizon, so that you've got this like sweeping panorama of sky and billowing clouds and storm. You've got the back, low horizon line to give you that deep recession into space that's more typical of the approach of Romanticism. Now, this is too making a statement, but this is an American specific statement. Now, if we want to first talk about the Romantic style in general, okay, this is definitely a reflection of man versus nature. Because you can see that there is cultivation, that's happening in this area of the painting down in here. And by the way, it's called Oxbow because this kind of roundabout way that the river has changed over time, that's an oxbow. So man versus nature. But the thing about Americans is that the American culture is very distinct in art history. And American art tends to address very American-specific themes, and that certainly is the case with romantic landscape painting. So what Thomas Cole is talking about with this painting is what he sees as the moral obligation for Americans to go out and to cultivate the landscape, to go out and to establish farms. And by going out and establishing farms, and you can see the farms, these really regular kind of geometric shapes in the fields. By establishing these farms, they are also establishing their civilized way of life. And when I say civilized, I'm doing those like quote marks with my fingers. Because civilization, as Americans from the 19th century are seeing it, this is definitely a specific cultural perception that is not without its problems. This is again, though, a reflection of the culture and the thoughts of the time. So, the idea is if you look at this, you kind of can divide it in half this way. And it's a diagonal division, not horizontal. Diagonal, that immediately should be putting into our heads tension, right? This idea of tension. So there's a division here, there's a sense of tension. Now, if you're not getting tension from the diagonal line, maybe you're getting it from stormy clouds, from lightning, from a broken tree, some sort of tension. This area of the landscape is unruly, it's untamed, it's wild, it's unpredictable. Where here, it's orderly, it's cultivated. This is dark, this is light. We know by now that light not only is a formal element, but certainly can operate iconographically. And that's happening here. The light represents civilization, quote marks. It also perhaps represents, again, Christian God. The message is is that without going out and cultivating the land and spreading these, American cultural values, which includes Christianity, that this creates order within the world. Here, this is what happens when you don't cultivate. Now, this is a veiled comment towards Native Americans. This idea that the Native Americans are wild, they're unruly, okay, savage. And I'm just using that word, super problematic, but again, the thoughts of the people at that time. And that moral duty is sort of rescuing the Native Americans from this more wild, untamed existence, providing them with the light of rationality, of order, of civilization. And here's Thomas Cole right here himself, painting himself into the picture. Little Where's Waldo self-portrait situation. Let's look at one more. Isn't this gorgeous? It's by Albert Bierstadt. His work is really recognizable. He made all these incredible landscapes that are so epic, so dramatic, highly idealized depictions of nature. So that idealism, the emotionalism, the epic quality, these are all very clearly romantic features. One of the things I learned recently on a trip I took to Yosemite was the relationship that people had with nature, the early Americans. One of the things about us in America is that our culture is pretty young in the grand scheme of things. And so we as Americans, we didn't have temples that were back from like first century Rome. And so what we saw as our temples, our cathedrals, because we also didn't have, 12th century Gothic cathedrals. What we saw as our temples and our cathedrals was our nature, our soaring, majestic mountains and mesas and buttes and all of those things. So there's a religious aspect to this, and you might have already intuited that with, again, the light of God shining down on this beautiful, unspoilt scene of perfection that he creates for Americans. The idea was to promote manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was something that Cole was kind of working with as well. It's our political obligations as Americans to go out as far as we can westward, to spread out, to settle, to spread our way of life. God personally wants us to do that. So these type of images encouraged people. Oh, hey, if you do the super risky thing of getting into your little wagon and taking a wagon train across the country, this is where you're going to end up, and this is where you're going to build your cabin, and this is your backyard. It's a pretty compelling selling point, I must say. One that conveniently erases the fact that there's already people here called Native Americans. They're completely erased from the picture, and that causes conflict because people don't realize that when they're doing their thing of manifest destiny. Now, another thing I want to point out, because this is our last slide and I want to take this full circle, is the relationship between between the literary genres and art. So in America, there was a literary tradition, maybe more appropriately referred to as a poetic tradition known as transcendentalism. Poets like Robert Frost and Ralph Waldo Emerson, encouraging people to go out, to be with nature, to take the path less traveled. That too appears in work like Bierstadt's, right? Go out into nature and this is what you see. And what happens when you're out here? Your soul is rejuvenated. And that, my friends, is definitely true. Go to Yosemite and you will have a religious experience. If you like this painting, there is a Bierstadt at the Phoenix Art Museum that you should go and you should check out. It's beautiful, it's epic, it's breathtaking. This is romantic landscape painting at its finest. And this concludes our lecture on Romanticism.